Okay, welcome everyone. It is now 2 p.m. and I know people are going to continue to trickle in as we get started with the introductions, but we'll go ahead and get started now. So thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the 7-part series entitled Understanding Trauma, Unpacking a Culturally Responsive Approach to Serving Sexual Assault Survivors During COVID-19. My name is Erica Blackwood, and I am the SADI specialist for NCCASA. Our focus is on helping advocates create accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed approaches to the unique needs of survivors that they're being faced with during the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and civil unrest. Before we get started with today's webinar, What is Trauma? Just a few housekeeping items. All webinars will be recorded and available on NCCASA's YouTube page afterwards. Certificates will be available at the end of the series, and our training specialist, Gabriella Nyman, will be handling distribution. She'll be periodically putting reminders for filling out a form for your certificate in the chat, so please monitor your chat. If you have any questions, you can use the chat box to ask questions privately to panelists or use the Q&A feature. We are moving into more difficult and heavy discussion topics. So please be mindful of taking care of yourself first. Please remember to use some of the things that you learned to ground yourself as we continue to move forward. If you need to step away or you need additional assistance, you can message the panelists privately. And now I introduce to you the host of today's webinar. I'm so excited. The founder and director of clinical services at the Center for Family and Maternal Wellness, Reia Chapman. Turning it over to you, Reia.
Sounds good. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. Certainly, this is a time for all of us to be healing on so many different levels, and so I am privileged to be here with all of you holding this space as we dig into interpersonal perspectives in historical and generational trauma. So starting off on a heavier foot, but throughout the course, then ideally we'll be on a more inspirational note. So why don't we just go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Reia Chapman. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I reside in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I own and operate the Center for Family and Maternal Wellness. It's an outpatient psychotherapy practice here in Charlotte. And we have several specializations, but we're going to be talking a little bit about our work as decolonized therapists and how it applies to addressing trauma. I also am the founder and director of the Social Justice Emotional Response Collective, which was founded also in 2016 after the murder of Keith Lamont Scott, and we provide on-demand crisis stabilization services to communities of color, particularly during times of social unrest. Feel free to connect with me on social media. I love connecting with my workshop attendees, and especially if I'm not able to get to your questions directly during the presentation, I would be more than happy to address them afterward. So let's get started. Today, we're going to be talking about trauma. So we'll start with some definitions and histories. We'll dig into understanding a little bit of trauma. We can also share a bit about ethics of care and making the case for decolonization. And then we will wrap up with some questions if there is time and appropriate. So I'm starting with decolonized psychotherapy. I mentioned a few moments ago that is the basis of the work that we do at Center for Family and Maternal Wellness. And as we sort of lay the groundwork for what is trauma, what are the types of trauma, how do we sort of heal and treat and deal with trauma, I want to start with decolonized psychotherapy and the reason for that. When I was in graduate school, seems like many moons ago, I had already been doing LGBT activism work here in Charlotte and across the state, and then ultimately started to encounter so many people who not only were experiencing bias and discrimination, but who also had unresolved, unmanaged, untreated mental health issues. And that a common narrative that seemed to occur is that folks were also experiencing discrimination and lack of accessibility in the healthcare setting. And so when I decided to go back and to earn my Master of Social Work degree, I had queer and trans people of color in mind, particularly the aging population. And so going through graduate school, I was the only out Black queer woman, the only Black woman who was queer. And I realized that even within the field of social work, which is a whole other presentation that I'll be doing in November for the North Carolina Association of Social Workers, is around the discrimination and bias and stereotyping that occurs within the field. But I realized that there were not many people who wanted to talk about issues specific to Black folks, especially issues specific to Black or brown folks who identify as queer and trans. This translated into my early practice experiences in doing crisis-based or community-based crisis stabilization work, and realizing that there was sort of this revolving door of people coming in and out of care with the same types of issues. And so in my other trainings, I kind of dig a bit deeper into that, but just in general, I wonder if this is out of order. We'll start a bit with language. And so if you've never heard the term decolonization before, nothing that's on this page is the right explanation or the right definition for that. And the reason why I placed this slide here is because most people, particularly folks with advanced degrees who are experienced, who are in professional settings, we're pretty educated people typically, that, you know, people at least have vocational experience, they can read, they can interpret things. And so one of the things that presents oftentimes as a barrier to addressing trauma is how we frame it. And so for the purpose of this discussion, I've listed here some common definitions that I found just in my search of how to identify colonization or how to define colonization. And I know that I can't see you all and you all can't see me, but isn't this such beautiful language? You know, when you talk about colonizing, well, I would love if folks would kind of drop into the chat box for me to look at later, if this definition of colonization is what you've understood and heard before, and if not, what do you understand colonization to be? But let's look at the first one. It refers to large-scale population movements where the migrants maintain strong links with their or their ancestors' former country. It sounds like I am entitled to this space, that I have the right to covet this space because I have a strong link with this space. The act of setting up a colony from one's place of origin, again, setting up a colony, it's like going on vacation, that I've, you know, decided to get a camper and go cross country and pitch my tent wherever, you know, I end up, right? The act of sending people to live in and govern another country. Again, it almost seems like a welcome sort of transition that, you know, I've sent a delegation of, you know, my ancestors to some place to live in and govern another country. So this is beautiful language of colonization. Conversely, but also kind of similarly, decolonization, defined as the act of getting rid of colonization or freeing a country from being dependent on another country. Freeing a country from being dependent on another country. It's almost like you've earned a rite of passage, that, you know, you've done so well being colonized that we're going to free you from this oppression that you've been experiencing for hundreds of years. Similarly, a process by which colonies become independent of the colonizing country. There's nothing in here that suggests torture, murder, violence, death, reparations, none of that. There's nothing in here. Decolonization was gradual and peaceful for some British colonies, largely settled, this is my favorite one, by expatriates, but violent for others, where native rebellions were energized by nationalism. This is Britannica.com, that there were people, the natives, the indigenous folks of this land perhaps, were energized by nationalism. This doesn't say these people were mad as hell for having been colonized. It doesn't indicate at all that families were torn apart, that people still are disconnected from their roots. None of that type of stuff. Lastly, to allow a colony to become self-governing or independent, it sounds like you're growing up, like you could drive with a driver's permit, and now you've graduated to being able to drive by yourself without supervision, is what that sounds like. Why is that important? It's important because when we don't use the appropriate language to name and to describe the truth, it is very easy to become disconnected from it and thereby not becoming accountable to it, okay? So quickly, decolonized psychotherapy I've defined as psychotherapeutic practice standards and interventions rooted in healing justice that center culture to achieve wellness in systematically marginalized communities of color. You'll see this definition again, so no worries if you didn't get a chance to get it down. I'm gonna move through this as well. I mentioned that decolonized psychotherapy is rooted in healing justice, which is a real movement. It is a real framework that specifically prioritizes traditions and practices of ancestors, culture, environment, spirit, physical, all the emotional things that center healing in relationship to our collective bodies, our collective memory, and our collective resiliency. This is relative to those decolonizing or decolonization and colonization definitions that I referenced a few moments ago, that when you take something away from someone by force, and then you systematically strip them of their culture, of agency over their bodies, of their language, their traditions, their religion or their spiritual practices, their connection with the earth. When you uproot ancient burial grounds, or you build idols to our former presidents in the sides of sacred mountains and call it Mount Rushmore, like, there are so many different things that have been systematically done to Black and Brown folks that sort of get at the root of our connection, not only with ourselves and each other, but the way that we heal ourselves. And this is just a quote from the Healing Justice Movement that really summarizes that. It talks about how our healing traditions are so massively co-opted that we need to sort of this non-surface level, bone deep healing because of the many millennia and the years of trauma that we've encountered, but also because those things are still here. Right. And so, you know, I'm sure that many of you have heard about the dual pandemics that we're experiencing, that though we're in this time of COVID-19, that America seems to, or the world even seems to be experiencing some type of racial awakening. And so a lot of people have categorize that as also a pandemic, that racism has permeated every social service that we have, every fabric or thread of our existence has been shaped by white supremacy and racism. And so this is not just a historical conversation. It's not about always about healing from the past, but it is also healing while navigating the present as well. So decolonized frameworks as practice, right? So in some, decolonized psychotherapy prioritizes connection and trust, whereas our existing frameworks for healing, particularly as a mental health therapist or any person in helping and healing professions and providers, prioritizes the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, which is, how we classify mental illness and provide treatment. Here, we use social justice to guide connection and intervention in decolonized therapy. And then oftentimes you hear the language or see the language of social justice kind of plastered onto things without any depth or any frame, a lens to appropriately navigate the work. And then decolonized therapy centers and embraces culture to achieve recovery. And in most professional settings, there is less emphasis on culture to achieve recovery. It's oftentimes seen as poor boundaries to feel emotionally or physically connected to the people that we serve and the people that we work with, that what is appropriate display of emotion? How do you navigate anger? There are a lot of, in the workplace, there are a lot of people of color in particular, who have been having a very difficult time holding space and focusing on their work during this season that we've been in, whether it's about the pandemic, whether it's about racism and over policing and the murder of Black and brown bodies. There are lots of things that people of color are holding, and they have no outlet for that. They're not permitted to sort of exist in that. And in also a lot of ways, there are people who are also being required to be the holder of spaces for non-Black and brown folks who have feels about what's happening in the world right now. So let's dig in. Types of trauma. So I'm sure that all of you have seen all of these things, some common things that people encounter around bullying and sexual abuse and intimate partner violence and things like that. I wanted to kind of give some space here to some ones that we don't commonly consider as violence, those being exposure to foster care or housing instability. Racial trauma is something that I am increasingly focusing on in my particular practice. And we're going to kind of sort of define these and talk more intentionally about them in the slides ahead. Refugee trauma, folks who are seeking asylum in a different country, perhaps in the United States, because they're experiencing such violence and trauma in their home countries. Traumatic grief. So sometimes we talk about death and dying and how people are affected by that, but more deeply when people sort of witness the death of someone. I've had several clients who have witnessed the suicide of someone or witnessed someone die violently in an accident or an explosion, things like that. Medical trauma. These are things that that we don't talk about too. It's like when people don't get an opportunity to get anesthesia and they have a lot of recurrent memories of feeling incisions or feeling stitches or hearing all of the sounds in an emergency room setting. Similarly, I didn't put this one on here, but relatively birthing trauma. Lots of treatment in the past for clients who were supposed to have a vaginal birth who had to have an emergency cesarean section, and they were not prepared for that. And so the healing and recovery, the surgery, how intrusive it is, sort of getting into reproductive oppression, that, you know, there are lots of evidence, lots of information, experiences, stories about Black and brown people of color being disproportionately recommended or even threatened, required to have cesarean sections as opposed to vaginal births or at-home births and things like that. So a lot of what is listed here is kind of how we encounter trauma. In the workshop that I'm going to be doing on the 20th, we'll kind of parse these a lot more around like how trauma continues to show up. But for the purposes of this this discussion, these are some ones to keep in mind. So one of my favorite ways, which sounds a bit morbid now that I think about that, to talk about how to understand trauma is through two studies. One of them is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. If you've heard of this study, send me a thumbs up in the chat. And if you haven't, then you're in for a treat. I love talking about this particular study. So for those folks who are unfamiliar with ACEs, there was a study in the 90s that was conducted by scientists who were trying to sort of operationalize the experiences of women who were experiencing weight loss and regaining the weight. So you can certainly read about the urban ACEs or the ACEs study, but there were these women who lost all this weight, and then at some point they gained the weight back. And scientists were trying to figure out, well, what was the cause of this? Why are these women losing, you know, tons of weight, and how they pack all this weight back on? And so, long story short, they developed a series of questions based on their interviews, that when they were kind of asking about these women's experiences, they started to notice a theme of things that were kind of coming up. And that's what you're looking at here on your screen. They noticed the theme of abuse, which comprised physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. They noticed a theme of neglect, again, around physical and emotional neglect. And then they also noticed the theme of household dysfunction around mental illness, and, you know, if there was a relative incarcerated, if there was any substance use in the household, if you witnessed your mom, you know, being exposed to domestic violence, or if there was a history of divorce. The abuse and neglect categories, these had more to do with if the youth had encountered these things personally as a child. And then the household dysfunction, of course, is more around like environmental exposure to these things. And so they were able to develop a survey and realize that overwhelmingly the women who were regaining this weight all had shared experiences around abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And so there were about 17,000 participants in that study, groundbreaking research on how we understand childhood trauma or early childhood experiences and what it has to do with how we develop and evolve as adults. Some of the things that we learned here around ACEs is, what does it have to do with the social determinants of health? So you may have heard these things as well, that for folks who have increasing ACEs, or the higher you score, I apologize, the higher you score on the ACEs survey, there are some assumptions that we're able to make because of that. So some of the long-lasting impacts of early childhood adversity is increased chronic diseases. There are lots of research that has come out that the more ACEs, or the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to develop chronic diseases like cancer and diabetes. There are lots of research that suggests the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to engage in risky behaviors like alcohol and drug abuse. The higher your ACE score is, the more likely you are to have sort of lower income, housing instability, poor health outcomes, meaning more likely to develop mental health or serious mental health conditions, more likely to contract infectious diseases, etc. And that's not to say that just because any of those things occur, that you definitely will develop any of these things. It's just a common theme based on tons of research and surveys and interviews with people who have these shared experiences. And also, to be fair, to level the playing field for everyone, at least 50% of people, actually the number is higher, like more like 60 or 70% of us have at least one ACE score. So very rarely do you find someone who has a 0 for an ACE score. Some of those statistics that I mentioned, fun facts, not so fun facts, that people who have an ACE score of 4 or more are 3 times as likely to smoke, 11 times more likely to develop intravenous drug abuse habits, 4 times more likely to have begun intercourse by age 15, tons of things. Oh, there we go. 67% of us have at least one ACE score. So a little bit of leveling of the playing field here. One of the most disturbing things of this slide is that, again, we've been talking about the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to sort of develop poor habits and have poor health outcomes. But there is increasing and significant evidence that people who have at least 6 or more ACEs can die 20 years earlier than those who have none. So again, how the environment that we exist in, the exposures that we have early, oftentimes do sort of tell a picture for us, or can predict the future in a lot of ways without direct intervention. I love this one too. In the field of psychology and social work, we oftentimes talk about a person's ability, or the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or in other words, our ability to self-actualize. That's what you see on the right-hand side of your screen. And then I've sort of have another picture here that mimics that square, but it's the ACEs. So at the very bottom, around experiencing historical trauma, is also correlated with base level needs, the need for air, the need for water, the need for food, the need for rest and health. And then you'll notice the arrow in between the 2 triangles from conception. So from the time that you are born all the way up until the time that you die, if you start on the left-hand side of your screen with experiencing a lot of historical trauma, it is also during the time where your ability to thrive depends on if you have your basic needs taken care of. That, of course, if you have a newborn baby, they need, quality air to breathe, water, food, rest, and good health. And also if these things, if there is a significant presence of trauma in the life, it can severely impact the development of that child. So as you move up the triangles around experiences, developing cognitive impairments, developing diseases, early death. Conversely, your ability to self-actualize and have appropriate coping skills, make good decisions, connect with people socially, emotionally, choose a good partner, pursue your education. Any of these other things is significantly impaired depending on the presence of trauma and adverse childhood experiences in one's life. But the thing about the ACEs study, even though it's one of my favorite studies, tell me if in the chat box, if you've heard of urban ACEs or not, and what do you think the significant, other than seeing these categories here, tell me what you know about the participants in the urban ACEs study versus the traditional ACEs study. What do you think? We talked about here, that there were tons of people who participated in this study, and we asked them these questions. Well, I didn't ask them these questions, but these questions were asked of them. The study was funded by Kaiser Permanente. That's a clue. And because I can't see you, and I know y'all are over there writing me some good stuff, I will go ahead and tell you for the sake of time. The 17,000 participants were members of the Kaiser Permanente insurance. So it was funded by Kaiser Permanente. And for those of you who don't know, Kaiser Permanente is kind of like an exclusive insurance company. It is typically people who are very wealthy, white men and their families are typically the people who have Kaiser Permanente insurance. And that's sort of the population, the majority, the population that participated in that study, 17,000 folks, were mostly white folks who were middle class or very wealthy. Why is this important? Because without including all of that, what we're looking at here is, what we're saying is, if someone experiences physical abuse, if they were hit or threatened, if they were yelled at, if they were, spoken poorly to, if they experienced sexual abuse, if their basic needs weren't met, like we just described, if they didn't feel loved, they didn't feel valued, that they didn't receive hugs or appropriate touch, if they had a caregiver or family member who had mental illness, or there was incarceration in the household, or if there was domestic violence in the household, if there was a broken home or divorce in the household, or being exposed to substance abuse, that it gives, this explains why there are, people who are more likely to abuse drugs, or to make poor decisions, or to be poor, or to be undereducated or not educated, or to die early, like all of these things. What we know is that those types of statistics are not typically associated with wealthy white folks. And that's exactly what the ACEs study proved, that even wealthy white folks have all of this problematic history. And so the reason why urban ACEs is important, or that the original ACEs study is so important, is that it definitely gave us a foundation. But because these were wealthy white folks, it didn't give us the community level adversity data, right? What does it mean to live in an environment, or what does it do to our ability to develop and thrive when we live in a neighborhood that we don't feel safe in, that we don't feel a sense of community in, where there was bullying by a peer classmate that may have gone unchecked, if you experienced housing instability or lived, in foster care, or if you had witnessed or heard, someone getting beaten up, stabbed, or shot in real life. So it's like, what are the environmental implications of people sort of taking the poverty piece a little bit further, people who may not only be living in poverty, but who also may be experiencing systemic oppression, or who might be systematically excluded from access to resources based on their race. This study, I've done a lot of research in representation of this study, particularly when it comes down to environmental trauma, like I've discussed earlier. What does it mean? What do we know about, those Black and brown folks who experienced the protest environment of Ferguson? What do we know about how those children who saw the militarization of a police force against their communities, and dogs and flashbangs and tear gas, what of those children and their ability to feel safe, not just in their neighborhood, but to be trusting and open of other people, particularly people in positions of authority like law enforcement or firemen or teachers, right? One of the things that I was particularly struck by, speaking of Ferguson, as an activist and organizer, I'm always, somewhere in the midst of the chaos, whether I'm on the ground or organizing remotely. I remember calling the local chapter for the National Association of Social Workers, and being willing to bring a delegation of social workers to Ferguson to provide mental health support for folks, or to at least, be able to redirect people to resources in the area. I wanted to know what the social workers, what anybody was doing to address the trauma exposure, or the stress, the post-traumatic stress reactions that people were very clearly experiencing, only to be told in writing that there's no issue here with any of that. I was flabbergasted that the ability to turn a blind eye to things that don't directly impact you absolutely is a foundational trauma for people of color, people who are marginalized and oppressed. Do you ever think about how jarring, or how sort of dismantling it feels to say, this is what has happened to me, and people not to believe you? That, it's hard for me to focus on completing my undergraduate degree when my neighborhood is in flames. It's hard to, focus on taking care of myself when I am underinsured, and I keep, I make $100 over the threshold to qualify for Medicaid, or maybe I receive some type of benefits, but that doesn't include childcare or transportation. Or if I am eligible to receive Medicaid, then I am also required to go to these special classes to help me get ready for job readiness. But I actually get a job, and the fact that I got a job prevents me from attending the classes to get a job. And so therefore I have to stop attending the classes, which means that I am now ineligible for childcare vouchers in the Medicaid program. It's just these perpetual cycles of discrimination, systemic bullying, even outside of social and environmental bullying as well. So the urban ACEs is a necessary and important complement to the traditional ACEs studies, because it does capture with more depth the experiences of low income or poor folks, people of color, people who are typically systematically excluded from resources. And I love the fact that it's not, the original ACEs study was done on predominantly white folks because it knocks the wind out of the sails for this is a Black or brown issue. It's not. That trauma is trauma is trauma. And the reality is that if any one of us, no matter what race you are or what your socioeconomic status is, experiences the right cluster or the right combination of early childhood experiences or historical trauma, any one of us could be a statistic. I love the fact that it humanizes all of us and also connects all of us in very significant ways. So out of that study came this concept of toxic stress and sort of the epigenetics of stress. What does it mean? What does it do to the body? It's the development of a person to experience trauma at a very early age during the formative years and to have repeated exposures. Dr. Nadine Burks is one of my girl boss crushes. Wrote a phenomenal book called The Deepest Well. If you haven't read that book, I would strongly recommend it. She provides a wonderful historical context for ACEs, how she started to incorporate it in her practice, the foundation and basis for how she started to understand the presence of the effects of toxic stress on the body and how to combat toxic stress and start to reverse the effects of early childhood experiences. So we'll go through a couple of these. Toxic stress very literally or very basically means your body's ability to sort of regulate the stress that you experience, and that at some point, the earlier you are and the more stress, trauma that you experience, your brain sort of makes a new pathway and just kind of expects that this is how it is. You know, it's kind of like, you know, if every day, you know, you come home and there's a cup of coffee on the table and you see it every single day, 7 days a week, you know, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a cup of coffee on the table. At some point, you start to expect that cup of coffee to be on the table. And if it's not there, then that seems weird, right? That why isn't the coffee on the table? It's always there. The brain acts in a more complex way, of course, but even in essence, even in the absence of a stressful event or a traumatic event, the brain is still behaving as if there is something to be alerted by, which oftentimes prompts aggressive behavior or emotional instability in behaviors that we tend to see in both children and adults. Similarly, around physical and mental health. So we talked about the obesity piece at the very beginning when we were talking about the ACEs study, the traditional ACEs study, that there are tons of evidence that suggests that there's a relationship between a person's historical trauma and weight gain, severe obesity, that there are lots of people who have inappropriate relationships with food, perhaps because they grew up with, you know, scarce or limited access to food, or maybe it is because it's the one thing that they can control, or because it was self-soothing, or because, you know, I mean, there are all of these different things. Similarly with mood, healthcare outcomes. Some folks, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, how are the rates of suicide increasing in younger and younger folks. Toxic stress, constantly being overwhelmed, the central nervous system being overwhelmed all the time, flooded all the time. It's not sustainable. Smoking, stroke, developing chronic diseases. Even this was something that was also super interesting in Dr. Burke's book, that there is evidence that suggests that your body does not process nutrients in the same way, and makes your bones more brittle, like the hormones and the fluids and things like that in the body slow down or thicken bones and joints and all of those types of things. They don't operate the same when there is constant stress, where there's, you know, police sirens and dogs and gunshots and, you know, being yelled at home and being ostracized or yelled at school, getting put on punishment. You got a whooping when you got home. You don't have enough food. You can't really get any sleep because there's too much chaos going on. There's not enough to eat. And when you go to school, you know, you may not have time to eat because you're getting picked on and the bully slapped your food on the ground. I mean, just this sort of constant onslaught of things that folks are encountering that absolutely makes it difficult to be physically or emotionally healthy. So something that I oftentimes share in my sessions, I always make jokes that I quote rap music, trap music, and song lyrics in my therapy sessions with my clients. And so I said a whole bunch of words, right? A whole bunch of things earlier on in our presentation. But one of the things that always grounds me and centers me is, how do I make this information accessible to the average person? One of my favorite quotes by Erykah Badu is, "What good do your words do if they don't understand you?" Right? Kind of going back to the importance of language, that you can make someone feel seen and heard with the appropriate language in the way that you can make them seem invisible and invaluable by putting the wrong frame on things. Some of this language that is pretty easy language to understand. It's important to be able to take those things and apply them to the population that you're working with and to yourself. And so while you may not be able to talk about urban ACEs or ACEs studies to your colleagues or to your clients, if you're trying to help them work through something, you can take the underlying concept of, you know, what does your environment have to do with your ability to heal and regenerate yourself, and to not become another statistic. So what makes this so hard? You know, what makes it so hard to understand how to address trauma, or what does trauma look like, or what are the differences in trauma in one particular group of people versus another group of people? Believe it or not, like, these are some of the common practitioner biases that I see. Some people believe that certain populations of people are experiencing difficulty because they're not pious enough, that they're not people of faith, that they should pray, that that it is God's punishment, you know, for them, right? Sometimes, especially if you're a practitioner, a licensed practitioner, misinterpretation of the code of ethics. I actually there's an entire training that I do called the Ethics of Decolonization, where we specifically go through the American Counseling Association and the National Association of Social Workers. Both have codes of ethics that are similar. And we go through the language of those and how we can misinterpret them to perpetuate bias and violence against Black and brown folks and queer and trans folks of color. Lack of training, right? That there's an unbelievable amount of practitioners who sort of come out with graduate and graduate or master's degrees, and they don't flip open another study, right? That we have to be committed to ongoing training and ongoing education about new developments in populations that we serve, but also a new science that gives us a deeper insight around the behaviors that we see. Because with the lack of training, that we're sort of going on assumptions, right? So if you no different than you have a kid who's being referred, for example, for psychotherapy because the teacher thinks they have ADHD. the teacher thinks, they're hyperactive, or they're defiant, they're oppositional defiant or something like that. So many times I have discovered that the reason for this child's behavior is because they're hungry, or because they're sleepy, or because mom, is in an abusive relationship. And so, lot of the bias that I also refer to in my trainings is diagnostic bias, that the behavior that you're observing may not be accurate to the diagnosis that you're trying to give, that it does require investigation and connection. And that goes all the way back to the beginning of the training, where I was talking about the importance of connection, the importance of centering culture, that there are things that are specific to communities of color, and the way that we rear our children, the way that we engage our community and members of our family, that give particular clues to what is considered normal or abnormal based on our communities. Lack of experience is what I'm describing here, is that I tell this to my supervisees often, that the textbook in the formal education gives a good basis of theory, but in reality, how we understand mental illness and the treatment of mental illness is through the lens of middle-aged white men. The test subjects for the DSM were middle-aged white men. The information that we have about sort of how to treat all people really stems from the treatment from one type of person, one population of person. In my ethics of decolonization study, I also give a lot of historical context for mental illness in Black and Brown people, and how misdiagnosis, lack of language, stripping of language oftentimes contributes to poor treatment outcomes, poor treatment engagement from Black and Brown people. I usually give a disclaimer at the beginning of my trainings that these trainings are actually designed to be full 8-hour multi-day trainings. And so I didn't give it this time, but you all, when I do the shorter trainings, they are very truncated. And so if it feels like there's a ton of information here and you want to dig into it, I completely and totally understand. I hope to see you all in some of my day-long trainings. It's well worth it. But these are sort of overview topics for consideration as well. Boundary issues that happens, either side, where folks are sort of inserting themselves ethically, professionally, socially, that creates a barrier or a bias for client, over-identifying with the client. Oftentimes when people talk about their trauma, this happens so often when I'm working with practitioners, when people hear about certain experiences that, for example, folks of color encounter, whether it's sexual abuse, sexual trauma. A lot of times I get questions around people who are unable to kind of hide their shock, and that a person actually encountered this, and if you're not careful, you will sort of make your client feel like you'll start to say things to them like, oh my gosh, like how did you even deal with this, or I can't believe anybody ever dealt with this. And while it sounds like incredible to you, it is also very ostracizing and isolating for your client or for your colleague. Or sort of a tangential idea is this kind of strong Black woman syndrome that that we encounter, that Black women are strong because they have to be, not because they were just born that way. Like there's a certain amount of resilience that comes from needing to survive, needing to take care of your family, needing to to make sure that you can wake up the next day and to get your needs met. That's not a superpower, that is survivalist. And I think just kind of, like I said, with the lack of experience and boundary issues, sometimes it becomes about how incredible someone's story is, as opposed to validating their story and moving toward treatment and recovery for them. Some other barriers that tend to show up in relationship to your colleagues, even to your family members, especially in clinical practice settings, that people, make assumptions based on race and skin color, a person's language. Funny story, I was doing Corona activities like going to McDonald's when I don't even eat fast food. My partner and I were in the drive-thru at McDonald's, and there was a white woman in a SUV right in front of us, and she was like yelling and screaming at the ordering screen, and we were thinking, what the heck is going on? And so this man comes out. He sounded like he had an African accent, but we could understand what he was saying. And we deduced, based on what he said and what she said, that this woman was like making him repeat himself over and over and like patronizing him for having an African accent. But it was not one of those where you literally can't understand what someone's saying. It's like you can understand what they're saying, they just have a heavy accent. And so it was a whole situation that like played out in front of us, but it made me think about what people do. It's like when someone speaks a different language, Spanish or something like that, and you just talk louder. Like it doesn't matter if you're talking louder, the person doesn't understand your language and you don't understand theirs. It's just the things, microaggressions that people, do that really is quite obnoxious. Cultural beliefs. We talked a little bit about that earlier around like healing. One of the things that has been the most rewarding, and I tell this story all the time, is there was a Black woman who came into my practice, and she was very particular. She was always well dressed, hair always, nicely styled, very proper, etc. And I remember like Black woman to Black woman being like, she's holding so tightly to whatever this image is that she needs me to see. And we continued to work, right? She wouldn't open up very well. Sessions were awkward in the beginning. And one day she came in, she sat down on my couch, and she took her whole weave off and put it on my couch. And she said, that is hot. And she let it all go from that moment on. And y'all might be over there in internet world cracking up and laughing, but I legit almost shed a tear, because I realized that she trusted me enough to be vulnerable. And kind of back to that experience piece, when for example, not stereotyping any of us, we're not a monolith. When you know how Black women feel about their appearance and their hair, not necessarily because of vanity, but because of historically, what does it mean to be presentable in public? That's absolutely connected to discrimination, stereotyping, assumptions, white supremacy, and all of that, right? That I have very vivid memories of my grandmother making sure that we were presentable when we went to the doctor, we were presentable when we went somewhere formal, and that the conversations I used to hear, it was related to, we don't want anyone to ask too many questions or to be suspicious, and invite DSS into our homes, or to invite, a curious teacher, or a curious look, or, someone to think something, there was a reason to pry, a reason to investigate, which was absolutely connected to my grandmother's ability to get AFDC or food stamps, for us to take care of us. Like the thread is much deeper than, there's this woman who's sitting on my couch who really needs to tell me all of these things, but she's trying to figure out if I'm safe, if I represent a system, or if I represent a healer, right? deep threads in doing trauma work and work particularly with communities of color as well. These are some things, just kind of wrapping up here. Some other parts of my series, I have multiple of these. These are some of the favorite ones that people like to take. Again, I'm happy to connect with folks offline, via email, anything like that. If you have any questions about any of the work that we're doing around decolonized psychotherapy, visit me online. My new website is launching in the next few weeks. And so I'm going to be creating some online courses and new trainings, downloads, and things like that available for you. So I would love to hear from you. And again, like I said, you can find me on the social medias, and then also please feel free to send me an email. I would love to hear from you and to get some feedback about what you thought about today's training. And yeah, thank you so much for today.